It was past midnight when Mark drove along the deserted highway. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, hiding the moon, and only the weak yellow beams of his headlights lit the road ahead. The silence inside the car felt suffocating, as if the darkness outside was pressing against the windows. Eager to get in, Mark yawned, rubbing his tired eyes. It had been a long shift at the gas station, and all he wanted was to reach home, shower off the smell of diesel, and collapse into bed. The radio played a faint old country song, crackling with static as the car sped through empty miles. Suddenly, his eyes caught movement ahead. A figure stood by the roadside, half hidden by the shadows of tall pine trees. Mark felt his chest tighten as his headlights illuminated a person holding their arm out, thumb raised. In that darkness, the figure looked like nothing more than a shadow with a human shape. Against his instincts, Mark's foot pressed the brake pedal. The car slowed, tires crunching on gravel as he approached the stranger. "Why am I stopping?" he thought. Something about the stillness of the night made the figure look unnatural, like it had been waiting just for him. The hitchhiker wore a long brown coat, soaked and darkened at the bottom as if he had been walking for hours. His head remained bowed, hood casting his face into complete shadow. Mark rolled down the window slightly, the cold night air sending chills down his arms. "Where you headed?" Mark called out, trying to keep his voice steady, though his hands trembled on the steering wheel. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves drifted in through the open window, mixing with the faint scent of gasoline from his work clothes. "Just up ahead. Keep driving," the hitchhiker replied, his voice low and scratchy, almost like the rustling of dead leaves. Mark hesitated, looking at the empty road stretching into the forest's blackness. But something in that broken voice made him unlock the doors. As the hitchhiker settled into the back seat, Mark felt a sudden drop in temperature, like someone had opened a freezer behind him. Goosebumps rose on his arms despite the car heater humming softly. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but all he saw was a dark hood and the faint outline of a pale chin. They drove in silence for miles. The only sounds were the tires rolling over cracked asphalt and the faint rustling coming from the back seat, like the man was shifting or breathing heavily. Mark tried turning up the radio to drown out the sound, but static swallowed the music. Mark glanced at his GPS, hoping to check how far they had to go. But the screen flickered and showed nothing, no roads, no signal, just a dark gray void. His pulse quickened as he tapped the screen desperately, but it stayed blank. "How much farther?" Mark asked, his voice cracking with forced calm. The silence that followed made his skin crawl. For a moment, he thought the man wouldn't answer, but then came a soft whisper from the shadows. "Almost there. Just keep going," the man whispered, his voice sounding closer than before. Mark's heart pounded. He didn't remember the man leaning forward, but now he felt his breath on his ear, cold and rotten, like earth after rain. Mark gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every instinct screamed at him to stop the car and run, but his legs felt frozen, as if an unseen force pinned him to the seat. He forced himself to keep breathing, eyes locked on the road ahead. Outside, the forest grew thicker. Branches reached out like skeletal hands, scratching and tapping against the windows. The sound made Mark flinch each time, his imagination conjuring images of claws scraping the glass, trying to tear their way inside. Suddenly, the hitchhiker spoke again, his voice echoing strangely inside the car. "Turn left here." Mark's stomach twisted as he saw a narrow dirt path leading off the main road, disappearing into complete darkness. He felt his hands turning the wheel before his mind could protest. The car jolted as it left the paved road, tires crunching over gravel and roots. Mark's headlights revealed gnarled trees pressing close on both sides, their twisted branches forming a tunnel of darkness. It felt like driving into the mouth of something ancient and hungry. Mark swallowed hard, gripping the wheel. Every few feet, branches brushed against the car with harsh scraping sounds, like fingernails on metal. He dared not look back, but in the mirror he could see the hitchhiker's hooded head turning side to side, as if watching the forest move around them. "How far is it?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The forest swallowed his words, leaving only the sound of the engine humming nervously. The passenger remained silent, and the only answer Mark got was the wind rattling dead leaves outside. Finally, after what felt like hours, the man spoke. "Stop here." Mark pressed the brake, the car lurching to a halt. In front of them was a small clearing lit only by the weak glow of the headlights. Shadows shifted between the trees like living things. "Turn off the engine," the hitchhiker said calmly. Mark hesitated, sweat dripping down his back despite the freezing air. His fingers shook as he twisted the key, plunging the car into silent darkness. The shadows around them seemed to lean in closer, listening without a word. The passenger opened the door and stepped out. Mark heard the crunch of boots on dead leaves as the man walked away from the car, disappearing into the trees. He sat frozen, staring at the spot where the man vanished. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. His instincts screamed to reverse and drive away, but his body felt paralyzed with terror. Suddenly, a faint light flickered between the trees, like a lantern swaying in the darkness. He watched as more lights appeared, flickering dimly in the distance. They moved slowly, like people holding candles and walking in a silent procession. But their shapes were wrong, some tall and thin, others hunched with twisted limbs. The hitchhiker reappeared, standing just at the tree line, his hood now fallen back. Mark's blood turned to ice. The man's face was deathly pale, eyes sunken deep into his skull, lips blackened and cracked as if he hadn't spoken to the living in decades. "Come out," the man rasped, his voice no longer human. Mark shook his head violently, tears streaming down his cheeks. But his hands moved on their own, unbuckling the seatbelt and pushing the door open as if pulled by invisible strings. The forest floor felt like ice under his shoes as he stepped onto the dead leaves. The air smelled of rot and earthworms. The figures holding lanterns moved closer, revealing faces twisted with agony, mouths sewn shut, eyes wide with eternal terror. Mark stumbled backwards, heart slamming against his ribs. What is this?" he whispered. The hitchhiker grinned, exposing broken black teeth. "Home," he said. "Welcome home." The ground beneath his feet shifted. Mark looked down and screamed. Pale hands were clawing out of the dirt, skeletal fingers wrapping around his ankles, pulling him down into the cold earth as the procession of spirits watched silently. He thrashed and kicked, but the hands were too many. As his body sank into the dirt, the last thing he saw was the hitchhiker's rotting face leaning close, whispering in a voice like worms crawling through soil. "Now you're one of us." Darkness swallowed him completely. The forest grew silent again. Minutes later, a car engine rumbled in the distance. The hitchhiker turned back to the road, pulling up his hood. Another driver was coming. Another passenger for eternity. The next driver was a young woman named Clara, returning from her nursing shift. Her eyes felt heavy, and the dim glow of her dashboard lights blurred as she blinked away exhaustion. The radio played softly, but the silence outside pressed against her windows like a warning. She almost didn't see him. A dark figure appeared in her headlights, standing perfectly still by the roadside with his hood covering his face. Startled, she swerved slightly before regaining control and slowing down beside him. Clara hesitated, her hands trembling on the wheel. Something about him felt wrong, like an old photograph that had faded just enough to distort the face. But guilt clawed at her. What if he needed help? She rolled down the window slightly. "Do you need a ride?" she asked softly, her voice quivering despite her attempt to sound confident. The hitchhiker raised his head, and she saw only darkness under the hood. "Just up ahead," he whispered, his voice like rust scraping metal. A shiver ran down Clara's spine, but before she could rethink, her hand moved to unlock the doors as he settled in the back seat. A sudden cold spread through the car, fogging the windows from inside. Clara glanced in the rearview mirror, but all she saw was his hood bent forward. Unmoving, they drove in silence. The only sound was her own breathing, shallow and rapid. Her hands tightened on the wheel each time she felt his gaze burning into the back of her neck, though she never saw him move. Where exactly are you going?" Clara asked, her voice almost a whisper. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his head tilted slightly, cracking as if his neck bones were dry twigs. "Turn left here," he whispered. She looked at the road and saw a narrow dirt path leading into total darkness. Her chest tightened with panic, but her hands obeyed before her mind could stop them. The forest swallowed them whole. Trees leaned in so close their branches scraped both sides of her car, making a sound like nails dragging across bone. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as fear closed around her throat. Finally, he spoke again. "Stop here." She pressed the brake, tires skidding slightly on damp earth. In front of them was a clearing, silent and waiting. He leaned forward, breath cold and rotten against her ear. "Turn off the engine." She obeyed, and the world plunged into blackness. Then, faint lights flickered between the trees, lanterns swaying slowly, carried by figures drifting closer. Clara squinted, her tears blurring their shapes into grotesque shadows as they came nearer. She saw their faces, skin pulled tight over bone, empty eye sockets staring without seeing, mouths torn open in silent screams. Her body shook violently as she pressed back against the seat. The hitchhiker stepped out of the car without a word. He turned and looked at her, his hood falling back. His face was decayed and hollow, crawling with black worms. "Come out," he rasped. "No, please," Clara sobbed, gripping the seatbelt so tightly her knuckles turned white. But an invisible force unbuckled her, pushing her door open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the stench of rot and grave dirt. She stumbled out, feet sinking into damp leaves. The ghostly procession surrounded her, their lantern lights flickering like dying fireflies. She tried to scream, but her voice froze in her chest. The hitchhiker stood in front of her, grinning with broken black teeth. "Welcome home," he whispered. Suddenly, dozens of pale hands burst from the forest floor, grabbing her legs and pulling her down into the cold earth. She thrashed and clawed at the dirt, but the hands dragged her deeper. The last thing she saw was the hitchhiker leaning down, his worm-eaten face inches from hers. "Now you're one of us." The clearing grew silent once more. The ghostly figures faded back into the darkness, their lanterns winking out like dying stars. The hitchhiker pulled up his hood, turning towards the road. Another set of headlights approached. And so, the eternal passenger waited, forever hitchhiking, forever leading the living to join the silent procession of the damned, deep in the woods where no GPS could ever find them again.